My issue speech is on improvements made since Hurricane Katrina. Imagine that you are the head of a low income family living on the Gulf Coast and working full time for minimum wage and doing all that you can to support yourself, your spouse, and your children and your elderly parents. One day you hear a mandatory evacuation for a Category 3 hurricane that is expected to make landfall in your hometown within 24 hours. Your bank account is empty and what credit cards you have are maxed out. Gas stations are running out of fuel and all of the stores are sold out of water. You think about evacuating on a bus and finally manage to talk your family into it, only to find that the bus is not evacuating to a safe shelter, but to a large building in the middle of your town. The hurricane hits the next day. You're submerged in the high water flooding. All power is gone, communication devices are not working, and you will be waiting days while hungry, dehydrated, and in need of medical care before anyone comes to rescue you or your family. This would be our reality if it were not for pre-planned evacuation plans and emergency response teams that are vital parts of survival during natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Michael. When Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005, the systems for responding to a hurricane of that magnitude were broken and failed on many levels to keep the public safe. Since then, improvements have been made to keep the death toll of recent hurricanes to a minimum. The devastation of a hurricane is something that we can't stop, but if properly planned for, the effects of a hurricane can be managed with minimal loss to human life. Hello class, my name is Joseph Parker Youngblood. I live in the Panhandle of Florida, near the site where the most recent hurricane hit in the United States. Although I have seen several hurricanes throughout my time living in the Panhandle, none were as devastating to this area as Hurricane Michael. Homes, businesses, and schools, churches have been demolished. Mexico Beach has been all but wiped away. Panama City Beach endured damage that will take years to rebuild. Although my area received minimal damage, the closeness of my home to the devastation of my neighbors reveals that this could have easily happened to my area. This sparked my interest in the process of planning, preparation, and emergency responses that have changed since the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. Today I'm going to reveal the improvements made with the processes of protecting human life in the event of a hurricane that aims to prevent the mistakes made during Hurricane Katrina that resulted in such a tragic number of loss of life. First, I will share some of the facts and discuss the differences in death tolls associated with Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Michael. Next, I would like to reveal what went wrong in the planning, preparation, and response teams for Hurricane Katrina. Finally, I will share the improvements made since Hurricane Katrina and how those improvements have helped with the rescue and recovery efforts during Hurricane Michael. Although I'm sure that you are familiar with the events that occurred during Hurricane Katrina, let's dive into a quick refresher of dates, the death toll, and important information pertaining to one of the worst natural disasters ever to hit the United States. And we'll compare the information to the hurricane that hit the Florida Panhandle just last week. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina was a Category 3 hurricane when it made landfall in the southeast area of Louisiana. Many people believe that Hurricane Katrina was a Category 5 when it hit Louisiana. However, according to the National Weather Service, in August of 2005, the hurricane peaked as a Category 5 hurricane with 175 mile-an-hour winds in the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico and weakened to a Category 3 with 125-mile-an-hour winds before it hit the coast. More than the actual hurricane, Robert Cahen, Brian Collins, and Helen Gibbons suggested that the failed levee system of New Orleans flooded a reported 75% of the metropolitan area. According to their research completed in January of 2006, the city that was already under sea level lacked a substantial levee system because the one that was in place was not well maintained. An article titled Hurricane Katrina Statistics Fast Facts from the CNN Library, last updated on August 30th, 2018, revealed that the death toll of Hurricane Katrina reached an estimated 1,833 people through direct and indirect causes. That's almost 2,000 people that passed away as a result of this hurricane. As many of you know, Hurricane Michael hit the Florida Panhandle on Wednesday, October 10th, 2018, as a Category 4 hurricane. The first obvious difference between Hurricane Katrina and hurricane is the category differences. The reason that Hurricane Katrina is classified as a 3 is because the winds were between 111 and 129 miles an hour when it hit the Gulf Coast. As mentioned earlier, the winds were 125 with Hurricane Katrina. According to Brandon Miller and Brandon Griggs of CNN on October 11, 2018, Hurricane Michael hit the Panhandle with winds at speeds of 155 miles an hour. To be classified as a Category 4, the wind speed of a hurricane must be between 130 and 156 miles an hour. As of now, the death toll associated with Hurricane Michael is 31, with 46 people still unaccounted for, according to the Hurricane Central of this Weather Channel website, dated October 16, 2018. Although any number of lives lost during a hurricane that is detected in enough time to evacuate is a shame, the differences between the number of lives lost in Katrina and those still missing or killed by Michael is more than 1,500 people. These numbers reveal a staggering difference in the way evacuation plans were failed, government and local official decisions lacked preparedness, and even the way that the rescue teams responded to these natural disasters. So as you can see, the major difference so far between Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Michael is the number of lives lost during the Category 3 and Category 4 storms. At this point, it is time to discuss the events that went wrong with the preparation and response processes of Hurricane Katrina. The short answer of these problems faced by Hurricane Katrina that led to the mass number of casualties was that both governmental and local officials were unprepared to keep the public safe from natural disaster of this magnitude. However, there are a number of events that reveal the level of unpreparedness in dozens of reports in the aftermath of Katrina. Gordon Russell wrote an article on August 28, 2005 for the New Orleans local news source called NOLA that shared the information of Mayor Ray Nagin calling for the first ever mandatory evacuation of New Orleans in history, which was prompted by a call from President Bush at 9:30 a.m. The mandatory evacuation was issued 20 hours before the hurricane made landfall. Although 80% of the population reportedly evacuated, according to the Environmental Public Health Impacts of Disasters Hurricane Katrina Workshop Summary, between 150,000 and 200,000 people did not evacuate. One study of the evacuees to Houston from the New Orleans Superdome disaster that we will discuss in a moment is reported by Lisa Wade of Pacific Standard Magazine on August 31st, 2015, found that of those who refused the initial warnings of mandatory evacuation, 14% were disabled, 23% stayed to care for a disabled person, and 25% were suffering from a chronic disease. Other information acquired during the study showed the picture of those who were unable to evacuate, as 55% lacked a car or other means necessary to evacuate. 68% had no money or usable credit cards. 57% had a household income of less than $20,000 per year. 76% of them had children. 77% of them had high school or lower level education. 93% were black, and 67% were unemployed. One of the major reasons for the large death toll during Hurricane Katrina, the failed evacuation plans by local officials. Let's look at one of the examples of New Orleans. Councilwoman Cynthia Hedge Morrill reported in an interview with Laura Sullivan on September 23, 2005, that the evacuation plan for New Orleans failed when people who had cars were told to head north, and those who did not have any means to travel were picked up at bus stops only to find a massive traffic jam that could not get everyone out safely. The Office of Emergency Preparedness then decided to take the public to the Superdome as a means of refuge from the storm until Katrina passed, when they would be bused to shelters 2 hours north of New Orleans. Instead, the levees broke, the buses were submerged in water, and thousands more sought refuge in the Superdome. In addition, 37 nursing homes did not evacuate. As a result of being stranded and submerged in water, hundreds of senior citizens died from heat and dehydration, and an unknown number of refugees in the Superdome died of related causes while waiting for rescue teams. So where were the rescue teams and supplies that you would expect Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA, to send in to assist the National Guard during natural disaster? FEMA was in the process of training and preparing emergency personnel in Atlanta on several sexual harassment cases. FEMA's history and lessons on how to deal with ethnic groups, according to the story published by Greg Bluestein of USA Today on September 7, 2005. According to the several sources, the blame game for who should have sent what supplies, what paperwork was necessary before making a recovery and rescue, and ultimately who was in charge caused all help to be delayed, and the victims of Hurricane Katrina suffered extensively. Chris Edwards from the Cato Institute suggested on August 27, 2015, that FEMA is ultimately to blame for the confusion, miscommunication, supply failures, indecisiveness, fraud, and abuse during the rescue efforts in Hurricane Katrina. Regardless of who was to blame, people died as a result of the inability to conduct an effective plan for both evacuation and rescue in what became the worst natural disaster in U.S. history as a result of poor emergency planning. The extent of suffering endured by innocent and mostly low-income victims was one of the worst disasters of our time. To those who can see the good in all things, it is evident that the suffering of Katrina victims has led to vast improvements in the way that the United States responds to hurricanes after the devastation faced by the Gulf Coast in 2005. Coastal communities now have emergency plans in place before a hurricane develops, and the warning and emergency response systems have drastically improved. According to Dave Phillips of the New York Times, an article written on September 17, 2017, reveals a quote by Denise Bottcher, the press secretary of the then Governor Kathleen Blanco, where the miscommunication and untimely manner of working with FEMA stated, We wanted soldiers, helicopters, food, and water. They wanted to negotiate an organizational chart. Obviously, there were problems with authority between local and government officials. Since the miscommunication and confusion of which plan to listen to was halted, the rescue and recovery of Katrina victims, federal and local officials, and emergency personnel now train together. FEMA has also improved to require directors to have experience with disasters as a primary qualification, which is only right since the ball is now in their court to plan and implement disaster relief with the new reforms. Another major change to the way FEMA operates is during the rescue and recovery efforts of Katrina, volunteers were turned away because they were believed to be a liability. Now volunteers are welcome when the emergency personnel teams are in need. The point is that major overhauls in the way the governmental and local officials respond to hurricanes has changed drastically for the better since Hurricane Katrina. Although the devastation of Hurricane Michael will be one to take years to recover from and has unfortunately ended in the loss of life, the most recent reports from FEMA show that progress in the rescue and recovery efforts are already proving to be better after 1 week than the conditions endured after Katrina in several weeks. According to FEMA's most recent report on October 16, 2018, federal and local entities are working hard together to conduct an extensive rescue and recovery effort. Rescue personnel from FEMA and the National Guard, along with statewide responders and volunteers, have already completed 152 evacuations, over 4,000 assist and rescues, over 21,500 in-place checks and shelters, 2,100 assists with animals, and have conducted 27,000 structural assessments for those affected by Hurricane Michael in the state of Florida. In addition, over 30,000 utility workers are working to restore power to everyone right now. Other federal organizations working along with FEMA to offer support, medical care, financial assistance, and supplies include the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. Department of Labor. Local organizations and businesses that are also contributing to the success and recovery efforts for the victims of Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Michael include neighboring churches, individual volunteers, the Salvation Army, Operation Barbecue Relief, Southern Baptist Disaster Relief, Airbnb Homes, Comcast, Xfinity, Datto, and Uber in Florida. As you can see, the government and local officials, as well as the community members, are all working together as a team to help those in need in the aftermath of Hurricane Michael. If the country had not experienced the tragedies of Hurricane Katrina, I can't say for sure that we would be prepared to handle the devastation of Hurricane Michael in the same way that we are today. FEMA has stepped up as a leader. FEMA Administrator Brock Long was quoted in the FEMA update saying, "Disaster response works best when it is locally executed, state-managed, and federally supported. FEMA is coordinating round-the-clock efforts by thousands of trained responders. Whether it is FEMA personnel, voluntary organizations, or members of the military, there are lots of people that are working to help survivors." I must say that I can agree. I can see the difference in the acceptance of help, the professional manners of completing protocol, but also the ability to think like a human without regard for organizational charts to guide each decision before we act to save lives, as was the case in Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina's devastating toll on the loss of lives of residents along the Gulf Coast caused many to suffer a great loss on August 29, 2005. Last week's Category 4 hurricane, Michael, has a confirmed death toll of 31 people so far. I hope that you can also have a better understanding of what went wrong with Hurricane Katrina as the evacuation plans and rescue and recovery attempts were halted by unpreparedness on both parts of the government and local officials. The mistakes made during Katrina caused changes to law, a total reorganization to FEMA, and has made it possible to lower the fatalities associated with most recent hurricanes as witnesses with the quick response of the government and local officials, as well as rescue and recovery teams. Although there is still work to do before we can protect every human life from hurricane disasters, we are making progress in that direction with vast examples of improvement.